There is an island in the western Pacific, roughly halfway between Hawaii and the Philippines, called Pohnpei. It is roughly 334 square kilometers of volcanic rock draped in one of the densest, wettest rainforests on the planet. It receives something like 7,600 millimeters of rain per year, which means it is almost always raining. The interior mountains vanish into cloud most mornings. The coastline is ringed by a barrier reef, and between the reef and the shore there is a shallow, sheltered lagoon the color of blue-green glass. If you fly over Pohnpei and look down at the southeastern corner of that lagoon, you will see something that does not belong. A cluster of rectangular stone platforms rising out of the water. 92 of them, by modern count, arranged in a rough grid, separated by narrow channels, connected by causeways. Each platform is built from long, hexagonal columns of basalt, dark, heavy, fitted together in a log cabin style, columns stacked perpendicular to column, rising in places to walls nearly 10 meters high. The basalt is not local to this part of the island. It was quarried on the far side of Pohnpei, or on the outer islets, and transported by raft across open reef water to be stacked here. The whole complex covers roughly 18 square kilometers of a lagoon. This is Nan Madol, and Lihwa was one of the people who built it. She did not think of it in those grand terms. Nobody does when they are inside the thing. What she thought about, on the morning I want to begin with, was rope. Specifically, whether the Senate lashing on the port side crossbeam of Raft 7 had been retied properly after the last load, because the last load had been a single column of prismatic basalt weighing something close to 40 tons, and the lashing had strained visibly on the final approach to the construction channel, and if it failed mid-crossing with a full load, the column would go to the bottom and the raft might flip, and the men on it would be in open water with a strong tidal current, and that would be a problem on multiple levels, not least of which was that losing a column to the lagoon floor was the kind of thing that required a ritual explanation to the Saudeleur lord who had commissioned the construction, and those ritual explanations were never comfortable. She walked the length of the raft while it was still beached, pressing the lashing between her fingers at each joint, tugging where she thought it looked loose, watching the Senate fibers for any sign of fraying or salt rotting. The men on the crew watched her do this without comment. They had learned not to comment. Lihwa's inspections were not performances. They were the reason the raft had made 47 crossings without losing a stone. Now, before I go further into Lihwa's day, I need to set down something that tends to get lost when people talk about Nan Madol, which is the sheer physical audacity of what was done here. Historians and archaeologists studying the site have noted that the total volume of basalt used in the construction of Nan Madol's islets and walls exceeds 750,000 metric tons by most estimates. For comparison, the Great Pyramid of Giza contains roughly 5.9 million metric tons of stone, but the pyramid was built on land with a continental workforce in an agricultural surplus system organized over decades. Nan Madol was built on open water on a tropical island with limited flat ground in a society whose total population may never have exceeded 25,000 to 30,000 people. The logistics required to move that much stone by raft across a living coral reef system using only human muscle, plant fiber rope, and wooden rollers puts Nan Madol in the same conversation as any engineering achievement in the ancient world. German archaeologist Johann Kuberi first described the site in systematic detail in the 1870s. Later 20th century surveys, particularly work carried out by the University of Oregon and by the Federated States of Micronesia's Historic Preservation Office, confirmed that construction began as early as the 8th or 9th century CE and continued through at least the late 14th century. The most intensive phase of building corresponds with the consolidation of Saudeleur rule, which archaeologists estimate at roughly 1000 to 1400 CE.
UNESCO designated Nan Madol a World Heritage Site in 2016, citing it as the only ancient city ever built on a coral reef, but also immediately listing it as a site in danger because the stone platforms are sinking as the underlying coral substrate erodes, sea levels rise, and mangrove roots split the basalt walls from within. Lihwa did not know any of this, of course. She knew the reef. She knew the tides. She knew that the wet season made the basalt columns slick and the raft timbers swell, and the whole operation more dangerous.
And she knew that the Saudeleur Lord, the current one, was the fourth or fifth in the dynasty by her count, she had stopped caring about the exact succession, had commissioned a new mortuary islet in the northern section of the complex, and that the stone for its outer retaining walls needed to be on site before the next ceremonial cycle began, which was 51 days away, and that this meant 6 to 8 crossings per week with no allowance for weather delays. She walked to the end of the raft and looked out at the crossing. The lagoon was calm, light wind from the east, no swell to speak of. The channel between the quarry landing and the first Nan Madol causeway was roughly 2 kilometers, and the current ran north to south in the morning, which was useful. The men were gathering at the beach, 12 of them for this crossing, plus 2 boys who were learning the work. They were eating breadfruit. They were not talking much. They had done this enough times that the routine had replaced conversation. Lihwa had been doing this work since she was 17. She was 34 now. She had started as a rope handler, moved to raft assembly, and arrived at coordination by a process of demonstrated competence that nobody had formally acknowledged but everyone had simply accepted, the way people accept the shape of a reef they have been navigating for years. The Saudeleur administration that commissioned the work cared about the stone arriving. They did not particularly care how it arrived or who organized the how. That was the space Lihwa had moved into and filled. The thing about the Saudeleur, the thing that becomes clear when you spend time near the top of their system, was that they governed through a combination of genuine religious authority and calibrated terror. And the calibration was beginning to slip. The Saudeleur lords were, in their own cosmology, descended from the gods who had originally built the first stone platform in the lagoon. Their right to rule Pohnpei was not a political claim, it was a cosmological fact, as established and inarguable as the position of the reef. They enforced this cosmological fact through a set of protocols. The proscription on anyone except Saudeleur nobles eating certain fish, the requirement that commoners approach Nan Madol only by canoe and only through designated entry channels, the ritual calendar that regulated planting and fishing and construction and virtually every other organized activity on the island that kept the entire population of Pohnpei in a state of constant awareness of their smallness relative to the center.
For a long time, this had worked. The center had been, in practical terms, worth the deference. The Saudeleur controlled the redistribution of resources through Nan Madol's network of specialized islets, the mortuary compounds, the administrative platforms, the ritual kitchens, the coconut oil production sites. A chieftain who wanted access to certain materials, or whose community needed assistance after a typhoon, or who wanted his daughter to marry into a lineage with better connections, came to Nan Madol and worked through the Saudeleur's ritual intermediaries and went home with what he needed, at a cost calculated in tribute and acknowledgement. The system functioned because the Saudeleur's cosmological authority was underwritten by genuine material capacity. But the building had not stopped. It kept going, decade after decade, generation after generation, because each Saudeleur lord needed to establish his own ritual monuments, his own mortuary islets, his own proof of divine favor expressed in tons of basalt. And the labor required to sustain that level of construction while also maintaining the existing structures, managing the tribute network, performing the ritual calendar, was grinding the island's commoner population in ways that had begun to produce something the Saudeleur cosmology had no real framework for: resentment that was older than any individual grievance and had become structural. Lihwa felt this as friction, not as politics. She felt it in the way the quarry workers' crews arrived late some mornings without explanation. She felt it in the way certain tributary chieftains sent fewer men than their obligation required and then sent a ritual apology that was technically adequate but tonally insolent. She felt it in the way the young men on her own raft crews looked at the Saudeler's stone and then looked at each other in a way that had changed over the past 2 or 3 years. Something gone quiet in them that used to be ordinary tiredness and had become something more deliberate. The raft was loaded. 12 basalt columns this crossing, lashed into 3 tight bundles of 4, balanced fore and aft so the raft trimmed flat. The men took the paddling positions. Lihwa stood at the stern, reading the water. The morning current was right. She gave the shove-off signal with a flat downward motion of her left hand, and they were moving. The crossing to Nan Madol took about 40 minutes in calm water with a favorable current. Lihwa used the time in a way she could not entirely explain, not watching the water, not watching the crew, but watching the walls coming toward her.
The basalt was black in morning shadow and warm gray-brown in direct light, and the way the columns were fitted, dry-laid, no mortar, the weight of each course pressing the one below into stability, was something she had watched being done thousands of times and still could not entirely reconcile with the fact that it worked. Stone that heavy, stacked that high in a structure that was essentially floating on waterlogged coral fill, and it stood. It had been standing for generations. The walls at the oldest part of the complex were thicker at the base and angled slightly inward, not by accident, she had always assumed, but by the accumulated judgment of every crew that had ever laid a course and felt the structure settle and learned from what the settlement told them. They entered the main approach channel. The walls rose on both sides.
The sound changed, less open air, more enclosed, the slap of water on stone and the creak of the raft's lashing echoing slightly off the basalt faces. A heron stood on the top of the left wall and watched them pass without moving. The channel narrowed toward the unloading platform, and Lihwa called the adjustment strokes, 2 short pulls on the left, a deep sweep on the right, and the raft eased against the platform edge, and the forward man looped the tie line around the stone cleat, and that was another crossing done. While the crew began unlashing the columns for transfer, Lihwa walked to the edge of the platform and looked north toward the section where the new mortuary islet was being built. She could see the work from here, a low platform maybe 60 meters away, its outer wall rising above the waterline on 3 sides, the 4th side still open where the filling material was being brought in by smaller canoes. 3 or 4 men were setting columns on the northern face, working slowly, pressing each column into position and then stepping back to look, and then adjusting. It was painstaking in the way that all dry laying was painstaking. You could not rush it without risking a collapse that would be worse than the delay. There was a man standing near the construction site who was not working. He was dressed in a way that marked him as someone from the Saudeler's administrative staff, the specific combination of fiber garments and shell ornamentation that signaled access to the upper tiers of the ritual hierarchy. He was watching the stone setters with an expression that Lihwa, from this distance, could not read precisely but recognized in type: impatience structured as displeasure, performing authority without doing anything useful. She had seen this expression many times. It was the expression of someone who had never set a column and needed the column setters to know that their pace was being observed and found insufficient. She watched him for a moment and then turned back to her crew. The Saudeler's administrative apparatus, the layer of intermediaries and ritual specialists and tribute counters and construction supervisors that had accumulated around the dynasty's core, was the thing that was accelerating the system's internal friction in ways the Saudeler lords themselves seemed not to perceive. The lords were embedded in a cosmological worldview that made critique structurally impossible. To question the pace of construction was to question the divine mandate that required it, which was to question the cosmological order, which was something no sane person on Pohnpei did openly.
But the intermediaries were human in all the ordinary ways, ambitious, territorial, willing to extract more than the system formally required when they thought they could do so without consequence, and the accumulation of small extractions over generations had produced a weight that the island's commoner communities were carrying in addition to the weight of the stone. Here is a piece of context that matters enormously, one that archaeologists have been working to reconstruct from the physical evidence at Nan Madol precisely because there is no written record. Studies of the skeletal remains recovered from Nan Madol's mortuary islets, particularly analysis conducted by researchers affiliated with the University of Hawaii and the Bishop Museum, have found evidence of significant nutritional stress in individuals who were not of elite status. The diets of laboring populations appear, from isotopic analysis, to have been increasingly constrained. Higher dependence on taro and breadfruit, which the Sautelur had progressively restricted to elite consumption.
This is not speculation. It is readable in the bones. Simultaneously, pollen records from sediment cores taken in the Pohnpei interior show forest clearance accelerating through the period corresponding to peak construction, consistent with the demand for timber for raft construction and fuel for the ritual kitchens. The island was being drawn down. The labor surplus that had made the first phases of Nan Madol possible was producing, by its own logic, the conditions under which that surplus could not be sustained. Archaeologists describe this as a common pattern in chiefdom-level polities that overinvest in monumental construction. The monument becomes the machine that consumes the society that built it. At Nan Madol, the machine ran for roughly 5 centuries before it stopped. Lihwa knew, in practical terms, what the skeletal record would later confirm. She knew it because she fed the raft crews, and she watched what they ate, and she knew what they ate was not enough. She knew it because her own household, she lived in a small stone-walled structure on the landward edge of the Nan Madol complex, in the section reserved for logistics workers of her tier, had been eating more taro and less fish for the past 4 years. She knew it because when she walked through the residential islets in the evenings, she could measure the silence, and the silence had been getting thicker in a way that was not peaceful. She thought about this sometimes, in the 40-minute crossings, watching the walls come toward her. She thought about it not as a political analysis. She did not have the vocabulary of political analysis and would not have considered it safe to develop one, but as a weight calculation. She was, fundamentally, a person who understood loads and tolerances and the point at which a lashing fails. She could feel that something in the system was at the edge of its tolerance. She did not know what the failure would look like. She had no model for it. The Sautelur had always been there. The stone had always been moving. The walls had always been rising. It was the only reality she had ever known. Then the stories started coming in about a man from beyond the reef. The name was Isokelekel. Nobody on Pohnpei had met him yet, at this point. He was a rumor, then a persistent rumor, then something more than a rumor, a presence in the oral network that connected the island's chieftain communities, passing from household to household along the paths of kinship and marriage alliance that the Sautelur's administrative grid had never fully captured. He was said to be coming from Kosrae, or from somewhere beyond Kosrae, with a force of warriors. He was said to have a grievance against the Sautelur. He was said to be favored by the same powers that the Sautelur claimed as their exclusive property. Lihwa heard this from one of her crew chiefs, a quiet man named Selt, who was careful with words and never said anything that was not already confirmed by 2 sources. He told her in the morning, on the beach while they were loading, in a voice too low to carry. She listened. She did not respond. She gave the shove-off signal, and the raft moved, and she stood at the stern and watched the walls coming toward her and thought about tolerances. The question was not whether Isokelekel was real.
Seld did not traffic in unreal things. The question was what real meant, here, in this context.
Seld told her that 3 of the chieftains in the southern districts, men whose tribute obligations had been quietly escalating for the past decade, had been in contact with people who had been in contact with people who were in contact with Isoke Lekel's advance parties. He told her this as a fact, without a judgment attached. It was her judgment to apply. She thought about the man on the construction site who watched the stone setters with displeasure. She thought about the silence in the residential islets. She thought about the diet that the bones would remember after everything else was gone. She did not think the Saudeleur deserved to fall. She was not a revolutionary, and she had not been wronged in any singular dramatic way. She had built her competence inside the system that existed, and she had earned something real within it. But she thought about what happened to a raft when the lashing failed. The stone did not vanish, it just went somewhere nobody intended, and the raft became something other than a raft, and the question of blame was less useful than the question of where you were standing when it happened. She started thinking about where she was standing. The construction on the new mortuary islet continued through the following weeks. Lihwa ran the crossings, 51 days until the ceremonial cycle, then 40, then 30. The weather held. The columns arrived and were set, the walls rose. The man from the administrative staff came and went and occasionally sent a junior attendant to tell Lihwa that the pace was still insufficient, and she acknowledged the message with a specific tilt of her head that was technically respectful and communicated exactly nothing. The stone moved at the pace that the stone could be safely moved, and anyone who wanted it to move faster was welcome to come and demonstrate how. What she was doing, in parallel, was paying attention. Not gathering intelligence in any organized way. That was not her role, and she did not want it to be. But listening to what the island told her in the ordinary texture of each day. She listened to the quarry crews. She listened to the women who managed the ritual food preparation on the specialized cooking islets. She listened to the older men who remembered the previous Saudeleur lord and had opinions about the difference in tone between that administration and this one. She listened to the channel water, which during particularly low tides exposed sections of the original stonework at the base of the oldest walls, and sometimes what was exposed there was not standard prismatic basalt, but older stone of a different character, suggesting that the site was a palimpsest, that there had been something here before the dynasty formalized it, a fact the Saudeleur's cosmological narrative did not have room for. That older stone bothered her in a specific way she could not articulate. If there had been something here before the Saudeleur, then the Saudeleur had not, in fact, founded the sacred center. They had occupied and expanded a sacred center that preceded them. The cosmological claim was partially correct and partially a kind of retroactive annexation. She did not know what to do with this thought. She had nowhere to put it that felt safe. She moved it to the back of her mind and left it there, where it kept making noise. The ceremonial cycle arrived, and the new mortuary islet was completed, or complete enough for the ritual purposes that the Saudeleur required, which was not the same as structurally finished, but was sufficient for the performance. Lihwa stood at the edge of the main channel and watched the ceremonial canoes bring the officiants through in their formal procession. The carved prow ornaments, the specific arrangements of fiber garments and shell ornaments that encoded rank in a visual language she could read as fluently as she read the tide. It was impressive. It had always been impressive. Nan Madol at the center of a working ritual cycle was genuinely magnificent. The black stone walls, the sound of the chants carrying over the water, the smell of ritual food from the preparation islets, the herons standing on the high walls as if they had been placed there deliberately. She felt, watching this, something she could not entirely separate from loyalty. She had built this, not the cosmology, not the mandate, not the dynasty, but the walls. She had moved the stone. Her hands were in those walls. The calloused palms and the rope burns and the years of 40-minute crossings were in the fit of every column she had supervised. And the columns were here, and they were standing, and they would stand for a long time after she was gone. That was real. That was not nothing. But she also thought, a wall does not choose who stands behind it. Isokelekel arrived from across the water, not as a rumor, not as a name passed along kinship lines, as a fact. A fleet of canoes, somewhere between 100 and several hundred depending on whose account you trusted, appearing on the horizon east of the island and coming in through the reef passage in the kind of weather that a person with long experience of the Pacific would not have chosen. High swell, lateral wind, the reef a white line of breaking water on both sides, as if the calculation of danger had been made and found acceptable compared to the danger of arriving.
In calm water, when the Saudeler might have time to organize a response. Lihwa was not on the water when they came in. She was on one of the landward platforms, checking a section of wall where a column on the third course had been showing a hairline fracture along its long axis, the kind of crack that meant nothing or meant eventual structural failure, and there was no way to know which without watching it over time. She heard the sound before she understood what it was, a kind of collective voice, not the usual sounds of Nan Madol at work, something with a different frequency. She walked to a point where she could see the northern approach channel. She looked at the water. The canoes were already inside the reef. The oral traditions of Pohnpei, and here I need to give a careful account of what historians can and cannot verify, preserve a narrative of Isokelekel's arrival and the fall of the Saudeler in considerable detail. The primary sources are the Nanwarki oral traditions as recorded by German administrator Johann Kubari in the 19th century, and subsequently by American ethnologist John Fisher and others in the mid-20th century. The traditions describe Isokelekel as arriving with 333 warriors from Khosrai, guided to Pohnpei by divine direction, fighting a battle against the Saudeler at a location on the main island, and defeating the last Saudeler lord, who fled and, in some versions of the account, was captured and ritually shamed rather than killed. Scholars treat this tradition with the standard caution applied to oral history that has passed through many generations and multiple periods of political use. The 333 warriors figure is likely a ritual number rather than a census count, and that divine guidance framing reflects how a successor dynasty naturalizes its legitimacy. But the core event, a successful outside challenger ending Saudeler rule, is consistent with the archaeological record, which shows a discontinuity in construction activity at Nan Madol sometime in the 14th or early 15th century, followed by a shift in how the site was used that corresponds with the traditions of the Nanwarki system that replaced Saudeler rule. The conquest was real. The Saudeler dynasty ended. What exactly happened in the days and weeks of the transition? Who chose which side? Who waited? Who ran? That is not in any record. Lihwa waited. Not as cowardice. Waiting was its own kind of judgment, and she had calculated it carefully. She was not a chieftain. She was not a Saudeler kinsperson. She was a logistics coordinator who had spent 17 years moving stone across a lagoon. She had no army, no alliance, no ritual authority. What she had was knowledge of the physical structure that both sides would need to control, and the patience to let the outcome arrive before she committed her knowledge to one direction or another. The battle, when it happened on the land, not in the lagoon. Nan Madol was not a fortress in the military sense. The water channels that surrounded it were a ritual and administrative structure, not a defensive one, and the stone walls were not designed to resist an assault from within the island's population, which is what an Isokelekel-aligned attack would be. The Saudeler's control of Nan Madol depended on the compliance of the island's communities, and when that compliance ended, when the chieftains of the southern districts made their choice, the stone walls became stage scenery rather than fortification. She heard about the last Saudeler lord's flight from one of the administrative staff she had worked with for years, a man who had always been careful about his loyalties and was now being very careful in the opposite direction,
demonstrating enthusiastic alignment with the new order in a way that Lihwa found both understandable and slightly nauseating. He told her that the Lord had fled north, then been caught, then, here the account became uncertain, been brought to Nan Madol and conducted through some kind of ritual that ended the dynasty's claim. Lihwa walked to the construction site of the mortuary islet that had been the last project she had finished under Saudeleur commission. The walls were solid, the columns were seated correctly, the fill was packed. She ran her hand along the basalt face, cold, slightly rough, the crystal structure of the stone visible in the morning light, and felt the weight of it pressing down into the coral and the coral pressing down into the lagoon floor. Sound, as far as she could judge, good for decades, maybe longer. Isokelekel's people would use this space. They might rededicate it, rename it, insert it into a new cosmological narrative that credited different ancestors, but the stone would be the same stone. Her work would be underneath whatever they built on top of it. She thought, a wall does not choose who stands behind it, but the people who build walls get to decide whether to keep building them, and for whom, and at what pace, and according to whose judgment of what is safe. She walked back to the raft landing and began checking the lashing on Raft 7. The centuries after Isokelekel's overthrow of the Saudeleur saw a gradual shift in how Nan Madol functioned. The site was not abandoned immediately. The oral traditions suggest it remained in ceremonial use under the Nanmarki chieftaincy system for some time, but the intense construction activity that had characterized the Saudeleur period ceased. Without the centralized tribute system and the cosmological imperative to keep building, the logistical apparatus that had moved stone across the lagoon had no commission to fulfill. The walls stopped growing, the raft crews dispersed, the channels slowly silted, the mangroves began their work on the stone. Modern assessments of Nan Madol's condition describe a site in active structural decline. The coral fill beneath the platforms is being undermined by tidal action and the probing roots of mangrove trees that have colonized every horizontal surface not scoured by storm surge. The basalt columns themselves are geologically stable. Prismatic basalt does not dissolve in salt water, but the structures they form are being taken apart from within as roots split joints in stormwater moves fill material, and the walls slowly disaggregate back into their component pieces. Several of the outer islet walls have partially collapsed in recent decades. The UNESCO World Heritage listing in 2016 was accompanied by an immediate inscription on the list of World Heritage in danger, and FSM government reports since then have described difficulty funding stabilization efforts at the scale required. The site receives a fraction of the international archaeological attention that comparable monuments in the Mediterranean or Asia receive, partly because of its remoteness and partly because the Pacific's indigenous histories have historically been lower priority in the global allocation of research funding, a disparity that Pacific scholars, including those at the University of the South Pacific and the University of Hawaii at Manoa, have been working to correct for the past 3 decades with increasing success. There is an attempt now to read the site more carefully than it has ever been read. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified subsurface features, possible earlier construction phases, possible storage or structural elements not visible above the waterline, that suggest the islets we can see are only part of the story. LiDAR surveys of the surrounding landmass have identified features in the forest interior that may represent the residential and agricultural infrastructure that fed the Nan Madol complex, the ordinary lives, the taro paddies, the breadfruit groves, the sleeping houses, the families, that do not appear in the monument itself because the monument was never meant to be lived in by ordinary people. It was meant to be seen, approached, supplicated, and feared. Lihwa's equivalent, the logistics workers, the raft crews, the quarry teams, the women who maintained the food islets, lived and worked and died in those invisible spaces. The monument records the Saudeler's claim to divinity. The soils and the sediment cores and the isotopic analysis of bones record the lives of the people who made the claim physically possible. She would have understood this distinction. She spent 17 years moving stone to build a monument to a power she served but did not own. She understood the difference between what a wall represents and what it weighs. She understood that the work of hands survives the intentions of the people who commissioned it. And she understood, in the way that a person who has spent years calculating loads and tolerances understands structural failure, that systems which mistake their own permanence for proof of legitimacy tend to run until they stop, and they stop all at once. Nan Madol stopped all at once.
And then the water came, and the mangroves came, and the coral grew over the fill, and the heron still stands on the top of the wall and watches the empty channel, and the basalt is still there, every column, every course, as dark and exact and indifferent as the day it was set. Lihwa said it. That is not nothing.